Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 starts with, actually, I would say one of the most famous passages when people quote the Bible. Most people don't know where it comes from, but people will quote this in the world and not even know it's from Scripture. But it's probably one of the more quoted verses. But tonight, what we're going to focus on is we're going to focus on these seasons of life, or even if to put it another way, within our existence, our human existence, God has woven into that certain rhythms, certain harvests, sowing and reaping, certain laws, if you could put it that way, the law of sowing and reaping. All those things are kind of woven throughout our existence. And Solomon here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, it starts with really this proclamation. Remember, he's just mentioned God for the first time, right? In the passage we looked at before, he's just mentioned the reality of God and how important it is that we look to God to find purpose and meaning. And then after that, he comes along and he talks about that there's a time for everything. Now, why is that important for us? Because what that means about life, and you know this, but it's a good reminder for us, is that life is dynamic, right? That life, for us as humans in this world, it is constantly shifting, it's constantly moving through different seasons, right? Sometimes we have seasons of great joy, sometimes we have seasons of great sorrow, sometimes we have seasons of great uncertainty, right? But there's always sort of an ebb and flow to life that we get to see unfold, where there's joy, where there's challenges, and all of those things, every one of them has its place in the economy of God. So none of those ebbs and flows of life happen by accident, all right? None of them are just, oh, well, this happened. No, all of that fits within God's sovereignty and God's economy as we live in this world. And a way to illustrate this, I guess, probably is best, and it's not foreign to, I don't think, anybody in this room, but, I mean, you think about farming, right, and how farmers live according to seasons, right? And you can't, every season has its purpose, right? I mean, you have the spring for planting, you have summer for growing, fall harvesting, and then the winter is kind of the resting time. But all of those seasons happen, and you can't rush them, right? You can't skip them, you can't change them. You just have to live according to those seasons that exist and happen in this world. And every one of those seasons has different struggles. All of those seasons have different joys, but all of those seasons have this certain beauty that comes together in all of it as you realize the picture of this cycle that God is showing us, the cycle of life that happens right before our eyes, right? And so, and for the farmer, the truth of the matter is as they go through those seasons, it's farming is one of those jobs where you get to, listen, if you sit at a desk all day, sometimes it's really hard to determine whether your work is fruitless or fruitful. If you're a farmer, not so much, right? As a farmer, you know, if your life is not fruitful, you know it, right? You get to, but if it's fruitless, you get to see that too. And so you see those things unfolding before your very eyes, and you know the importance of what seasons mean. And so Solomon is going to look at that reality, but he's going to look at it a little bit different through these sort of contrasting statements that we're going to talk about tonight. But he is painting that same sort of picture of farming. You know, just like a farmer's work has a time for planting, a time for reaping, all of those things, our lives have seasons that are of joy and of sorrow. There are seasons in our life of growth. There are seasons of letting go. There are seasons of building. There are seasons of breaking down. And Solomon looks at those things and reminds us in a direct and indirect way that all of those seasons that we face, that God has a purpose for those things. Even if we don't understand it, God still has a purpose for it. And as we look at this text tonight, I want you to think about the reality of what it means to trust in God's timing. right? What it means for us to accept every season as a part of God's greater plan, right? Because oftentimes what we do in our life is we get so focused on the sorrow or the heartache or the hardship of one season that when that breaks and we move to a new season, we have such a hard time letting go of what we've just come out of that we may waste part of the season of joy in our life because we're so focused on what we've just come out of. But listen, everybody's life is hard, right? You're not the exception, right? You're going to struggle with things that people in this room have already gone through. That's why the church is a beautiful thing, is because, well, I come out of a season, and maybe you're walking into that season, right? And so we can work through those sorts of things together. But it's important for us to remember and accept that these seasons are just a part of life, and learn what it means to have patience and trust, right? Because it's true that we may not always see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it doesn't mean it's absent. It doesn't mean there's not a light at all. Sometimes it's just around the next bend. Sometimes it's just about the next decision before the light at that end of the tunnel begins to break through. But in that, do we have patience and do we have trust? Do we have peace in knowing that no matter the season we're going through in our life, that God is at work? Right? Even in the seasons of tragedy, God is at work. Just like He is in the seasons where we're on the mountaintop. God's purpose is woven through all of this life that we have. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, he says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what's planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down, a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to loose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." Solomon says in verse 1, "For everything there is a season." When he says that, what he's doing for us is he's pointing to the truth that life operates that way. I said the word dynamic earlier. That's really the best way to describe it. Life as a human being is a dynamic organism as we operate in this world, right? You know this. Any one of us could go to a regular doctor's appointment tomorrow, and all of a sudden the season of our life could change dramatically, right? Or you could wake up tomorrow morning and experience a season of loss that you never expected would happen. Or you could wake up tomorrow and experience a season of joy. It could be the beginning of a season of joy that has been not so present for a while, right? All of life happens in cycles and seasons, and all of it happens in an appointed time. The Hebrew word for seasons is zamahan, and it literally means a fixed or appointed time. So it's not just that it happens by accident, but it happens in a purposeful and reasoned way. Well, whose purpose and reason would determine that? Well, of course, Solomon would say that's God, right? It's showing us that life is not comprised of a bunch of random moments that we take hold of, but life consists of a beautiful tapestry that God has put together called Eric's life and Lisa's life and Jay's life. And so these seasons kind of encompass all of our human experiences, whether it is good or bad. And we see that reality as we move through these different phases in our life, every one of them teaching us something unique, teaching us something new, giving us a new perspective. And so all of the things that we go through in our life, we go through on purpose. God is showing us things. God is teaching us things. God is showing us about Himself through those things. The question is, are we looking for those things during those seasons? Because Solomon has told us in the first 2 chapters that if you live your life self-absorbed, if everything in the world revolves around you and you look at things under the sun, then everything that you look at is going to be disappointing and vanity, and it's all going to leave you empty. And now finally, he's turning the corner to say, if you want purpose and meaning, you got to look to God. That's what he's just said at the end of the previous chapter, right? And then he comes right behind that and says, okay, now let's talk about those seasons in your life. Let's talk about the things that you're going through in your life. Because, again, if you look at them from the wrong perspective, it's all going to be vanity. But if you look at them from the right perspective, understanding that everything that happens in your life is appointed, it happens in a fixed time, it doesn't happen by accident, but instead by the sovereign plan of God, then that gives you a reason to hope. Because then everything that I'm going through it has a specific function within God's design. Right? Why is this important for us? Well, when you think about nature and you think about seasons of growth and rest and renewal and all that, we experience seasons in our life of learning, of healing, of loss, of growth, yes, but within that, when we're going through those things, right, when we're looking at our life, when we have a right perspective on things, then, and we understand that God is using the good, the bad, and the ugly for our good, when we really take hold of that and understand that, then it leads us less asking the question, why? And more asking the question, okay, God, I see what I'm going through right now, and I don't understand the why. I don't need to understand the why. God, just draw near to me until I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Because if we lose our perspective and we lose our focus, then we get so wrapped up in asking why that we never learn anything. Right? Some of you in this room may be praying, God, I need more patience, right? It's that kind of age-old thing. If you pray for patience, be ready, right? Because God is going to teach you patience. Well, that's kind of how the seasons work in our life. We'll say, well, God, I want to have stronger faith. And then things happen in your life that have the opportunity to draw you into stronger faith. But what happens sometimes? You lose perspective, and you get so wrapped up in asking the question why that you don't see that God is moving right in front of you to build your faith. He's refining your faith, right? He says in 1 Peter 1, it's tested by fire, right? It's refined like gold. And so we can't, when we shift our perspective, when we get lost in the situations and circumstances of the seasons that we're going through, then we lose sight. We lose sight of the one who is sovereign over all of these situations and circumstances. And the truth of the matter is that every one of these seasons in our life, they're temporary. And so if you're dealing with a season of loss, even if it's a long season, it's temporary. We just embrace it when it comes. We don't try to rush it. If you're going through a season of loss, you don't try to rush through it to where you don't try to rush through so that you can heal, right? So that your heart can feel better, because that's not the way God uses seasons of loss. God uses those seasons of loss not to make us feel temporarily better, but instead to help us see what it means to have peace that surpasses all understanding. For some people that happens in a short season, and sometimes it happens in a long season, but we trust and the one who's sovereign over those seasons. And so we should be present and faithful in whatever season we find ourselves in our life right now, knowing that every one of them has a divinely inspired purpose. Meaning, and that's good news because that means as we're indwelt by the Holy Spirit, that we can seek God's guidance and wisdom in those seasons. And then guess what he says? If you ask anything you ask, right? If you lack wisdom, ask, and what does it say? God will give it to you, right? And so in those seasons, if you lack wisdom, ask. And know that God is working in them. Right? God is not a clockmaker where He creates you, He fashioned you in your mother's womb, and He winds up the dial of your life and just sets you off into the great unknown. No, God is intimately involved in your life from the moment of conception to the moment you breathe your last breath. It's up to you whether you respond when God draws you to Himself. And everything we talked about on Sunday, it's, are you responding by faith? And then are you living in light of that faith? But that's on you as you're indwelled by the Holy Spirit to respond to His leading, to understand that in seasons of joy, God is there. In seasons of mourning, God is there. In seasons of building, God is there. In seasons of tearing down, God is there, right? That's what Solomon is trying to get us to take hold of, that God is always there. That God is not in the great equation of your life and your purpose and the seasons of your life, the problem is not God. God isn't the problem. God's the solution. The problem is you, right? The problem is your own sinful heart. And so what Solomon is saying, you got to lean not on your own understanding, but you got to lean on Christ. You got to lean on God. And when we do that, we experience wisdom, godly wisdom, wisdom that says that there is a time for every matter under heaven. He says in the last half of verse 1. So it's not just that, he's not just pointing to seasons. He is literally telling us here that it's not just that God is sovereign over seasons, but that every time under heaven, that God, it falls under the sovereignty of God. Every matter, every event, it falls under God's control. It fits within God's divine timeline. And this under heaven, we've talked about it being from a human perspective, but here it means something a little bit different because there's a shift in the context. Right? Before we were talking about viewing everything from an earthly plane, right? Under heaven, under the sun type of reality. But now he's shifting more to a perspective of looking at things from a heavenly perspective. And so now it's not about looking at things from this plane, but instead understanding that no matter what's happening, that the timing of these things are part of a higher divine order that you may not fully comprehend, but you can trust. Right? I pray all the time, Lord, I trust in your will because it's perfect and good. Why? Because I believe that. Because Jesus himself prayed, not my will, but your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. I pray that all the time because that's what I want. Because I don't comprehend a lot. I don't comprehend the plan of God and the will of God in certain situations because I'm not omniscient. I don't know everything. But I know a guy, right? And so I go to him and say, God, not my will, but your will be done. Because I understand that everything that happens in this life, it's not a cosmic accident. Right? This issue with my eye, it didn't happen by accident. Now, I have no idea what God was trying to teach me still, but I'm still learning, right? Sometimes it's patience. Sometimes it's leaning not on your own understanding, but leaning on those who God surrounds you with, like doctors and things like that. But it's about trusting and believing that we can either lean on God's timing or our timing. And listen, it's just like everything else Solomon said. If you lean on your timing, you're going to be disappointed. It's going to be vanity. Because we live in a culture now where, especially nowadays, I have everything I could ever need right here. Right? If I need the internet, I can look up anything on the Googles, right here on the phone. The YouTubes, right? I can open up YouTube and watch a video, TikTok, about anything. Right? Anybody I need to reach on the planet, I can pick this thing up and find a way to contact them. I have everything I need right here. And so when we're going through seasons in our life, sometimes we start looking at things from this perspective and we say, man, it's not happening how I want it to happen. God, it ain't happening fast enough, right? Those are things that people pray. God, I trust in your will, but I would really like for your will to happen now. Right? Lord, I trust that during this season that you're working, but I'd really like to move on to the next one. But that's not the way it works. Because God is looking at things from an eternal perspective. And our goal should be to align our understanding with God's perspective. Because God's the only one that's got a comprehensive plan. Right? God's the only one that's got this thing under control. If you don't believe me, sometime go read the Gospels and you'll find out that God has actually got this thing under control. Right? Whether it's sickness, disease, demon possession, right? Any of those things, whether it's whether Al Gore likes it or not, the weather and the climate. God has control over that too. But Jesus literally spoke. And the storm ceased. The water responded to his sovereign power as he walked across it. Every matter, Solomon says, in our life, every single one of our life circumstances, from birth to death, from joy to sorrow, building, tearing down, all of those things, are wrapped up in God's plan. What does that mean for you, for us? It means that there's nothing outside of God's awareness or control. It means that when something tragic happens in your life, God isn't taken aback on the throne. So when you go to God honestly about the way that you feel, God is like, oh, God isn't like, well, I didn't see that one coming. No, God knows. God knows, and God isn't offended by when you respond to a situation in your life with anger and frustration. God isn't mad at you. God knows. God knows you intimately. And so when you experience loss and you ask God why, God isn't up there saying, oh, no, he didn't, right? How dare you question my sovereign plan? No, God says, I know, I understand the sting of loss. But cling to me and my plan and my sovereignty, and I promise you, I will see you to the other side. And when we accept that God is orchestrating our lives with perfect wisdom, that should bring us peace. At least it does for me. Because when I don't know what's happening, and I've said this to some people at this church before, I've said, listen, sometimes I have dumb blind faith. Not all the time, but sometimes I really do. Sometimes I'm like, okay, God, like I know this is what you want me to do. I have no idea where it's going. I have no idea what the results will be. But God, I know you've laid this on my heart, and this is what I'm going to do. And I just do it. And people say, well, what's the end goal? Well, I don't know. I know that God has laid this on my heart to do it, and I'm just going in faith, right? In those moments of blind faith. And I trust that at the other side of it, that God is going to teach me something. Now, that something may be, right? It may not be something pleasant, right? It may not be that God gives me a pat on the back and say, well done. It may be that God humbles me and says, maybe we can do this different next time, right? But I have peace in uncertainty with this eye thing. I had peace about it, right? It was what it was going to be, right? Whether they were going to give me a fake eye or a bionic eye or whatever, like it was going to be okay. Because God has got this thing. And that frees us from worry. It frees us from worry, and it helps us embrace every day as a part of His plan. Why do you think God says so many times, do not fear? Do not fear. Why does He say that so much to His people? Because we don't have to fear. Because the biggest fear that could ever captivate us is death. At the end of the day, that's the most tragic thing that can happen to you is that you die. And what do we know about Christ? He defeated death. The power that death had over us is gone. So as Christians, we literally have nothing to fear. We have nothing to fear. And so we can live a life of patience. We can live a life of faith. We can live a life of surrender. Because there's a time for every matter under heaven. And so we can live in these changing phases of our life. And we don't hold on to this season or that season tightly, because every one of the moments that God gives us on this earth is a gift from Him. And in those seasons and in those moments, we just trust. We trust that all things are working together for good. Now, whether we believe it or not, I can't do that for you, right? Whether you believe it or not, that's another thing. But that's the promise and the truth of God's Word. Is every moment's a gift, and He's working in all of it together for our good and for His purpose. What does that do for us practically? It gives us a long-term perspective, right? As Christians, we're not focused on these light momentary afflictions, right? Because it doesn't compare to the weight of glory, right? It doesn't compare to the moment where we're standing face to face with Jesus. And so all of these things in our life that people have happen to them, it's the most tragic and the biggest thing that could ever happen in their life. For the Christians, we say that, we look at those things and we say, listen, this is one part of a much bigger picture. This is one moment in a much bigger story. And so that leaves us with that even the difficult seasons will end. Even the difficult seasons will end. And the purpose of even the difficult seasons is our good and God's glory. So God is in every season, every situation, every circumstance. And so we acknowledge that God has an appointed time for everything. God knows when I'm going to breathe my last breath on this earth. It's not going to be a shock to God. It's going to be a shock to the people around me. Yes. Right? But God knows. And so for me, it gives me the opportunity to look around and see that there's nothing in this life that can happen. There's nothing in this life that is going to happen, whether it's a joy or a struggle, that God isn't at work in. God's always working. He's not asleep at the wheel. So it leads us to appreciate God's wisdom and His purpose, even when we don't understand it. And Solomon goes on from the sovereign plan of God and the purpose of God, and he gives 14 pairs of opposites, basically. Everything from activities to emotions to experiences that we encounter in our life. And he uses these things to illustrate that every event, right, every single event has its place and has its time. All of it's overseen by God. And so there's balance and there's order in life. There's balance and there's order in these seasons as we look to God as sovereign over all. He says in verse 2, there's a time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant, a time to pluck up what's planted. He starts with life and death, right? Life begins at conception, right? The moment, that's even been hijacked. Life begins at fertilization, right? And it ends at death. And both of those things are set by God. Both of those things set by God. And so those two events are out of our control. I understand there's IVF and all that stuff, but even that, God determines fertilization. God does that. That's an act of God, a gift of God every single time. When we die, at the end of our life, that's in God's timing too. And so what we have here right off the bat is we have new beginnings. That's birth. Birth always represents these new beginnings, right? The new birth, right? Then what salvation is called, it's that new beginning of life in Christ. So birth represents new beginnings, and death reminds us that there is an inevitable end to all things. Right? Everything has an ending. Well, except for God. But everything else has a beginning and has an end. So there's birth, there's life and death. There's a time to plant, a time to pluck up what's planted. Now, this is obviously an agricultural metaphor, right? Obviously. There's seasons, just like I talked about, that can't be rushed. But this same sort of thing is true in our lives as well. There are times in our life for planting. What do I mean? There are times in our life where we should invest in, that we should be working in. And there are times for harvest where we reap the benefits of what we've invested in and what we've worked in. And so Solomon, what he's doing here is he's acknowledging the beginning and the end first, and then he's acknowledging that productivity and rest both have their place in the middle of this life. So in between birth and death, right, we're planting and we're harvesting, we're working and we're reaping the benefits of that work. All of it has its place in our life, and all of it is overseen by God. Because listen, the work that you do is a blessing, and what you receive from that work, what you harvest from that work, is also a blessing. All of it is a blessing. Now, you may debate that depending on the day that you have, right? Depending on the season that you're going through at work. But the truth of the matter remains that those things are blessings from God. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. Verse 3, a time to break down and a time to build up. Now, the word kill here, it's not just what we think of. It means any action that involves loss or ending. So it's not necessarily a literal killing, but it's loss and ending. So there's seasons of destruction and loss. But with that, there are seasons of mending and restoring, right? The word heal, it's a times of repair, of renewal, right? Of reconciliation, where that which was broken is made whole again. And we see this, right? Practically worked out. There are seasons in our life that are marked by immense brokenness. And then God comes behind that and brings a time of restoration and healing. There's a time to break down and a time to build up. Listen, there are times in our life where we don't need to be about building up. We need to be about tearing down. You know that? There are times in our life where we need to walk into the temple and flip the table. Right? There are times in our life where we need to tear down structures. We need to tear down, not that one I'm speaking, okay, that one's a metaphor. Don't do that. All right? It's weird that in 2024 I have to say those things because somebody on the YouTube will go tear a statue down and be like, hey, this crazy dude in Ohio told me there's a time to tear down stuff, right? So, no, not that, not literally. But there are times where we need to tear down relationships too. There are times where we need to walk away from relationships. Now, I'm not talking about in the weird world that we live in right now where all these crazy folks on these social media is like, well, my family member voted this way, so I'm just going to cut ties with them because they're fascist Nazis and everything else. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about in your life, there are relationships that are not building you up, that are tearing you down, that are destroying your faith and they're destroying you as a person, and you need to break those relationships. There are times where you need to tear down ideas in your mind, where you have a certain thought about something, and it's a wrong way to think. And you need to tear that down, right? There are times in your life where structures, relationships, ideas, they no longer serve a purpose. You need to tear them down. On the flip side, there is a time of building up. What does that mean? It literally means what you think. It's a time of construction, a time of growth, a time of strengthening. Right? So what Solomon says is there's a time where brokenness and loss are going to be a part of your life, and there's going to be a time of healing and restoration. And in your life, there are going to be times where things need to be torn down so that the season can come where things are being built up and strengthened in a healthy way. Right? Sometimes the relationships that you have with some people, you need to break off those relationships with those people so that you can move forward and have a healthy relationship with somebody else. Right? And that includes, listen, that includes sometimes your family. Sometimes there are people in your family who are destructive and horrible and tear everything down, right? Sometimes you need to break off that so that you can move into a time of building up. And maybe that means that person hears the gospel and you preach the gospel to them and they get saved. Maybe that's what it is. Or maybe you move out of that relationship and find a church family that shows you healthy family relationships and you're built up in that way. But what Solomon is pointing to here is healthy development and progress. That's what we see in that verse. He also says in verse 4, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. We'll talk about that in a minute. A time to weep and a time to laugh. Why do we have that here? Well, because human emotions are natural responses to the situations in your life. Like when you stub your toe and it hurts and you get angry. God isn't like, oh, be angry but sin not. That's right. God knows when you hit your thumb with a hammer, right? When you get if you're a sibling and you get in a fist fight, at least that's how we worked with your sibling, right? You have those emotions that you have love and you have compassion and all and hurt and all of those things, and you experience those range of emotions from sorrow to joy and everything in between, and all of those things are appropriate in its time. Right? There's a time where we cry as we process grief, and that's okay. Right? It's that whole thing like in the other side, not the Nazi fascist side, but there's some weird people on this side that are like, man, if you're a real man, then you never show emotion, you never shed a tear and all that. If you do that, you're going to raise little demons that run around this earth, because you're going to raise kids who have a father who lacks all emotion, and they're going to end up being little psychopaths who show no emotion at all. Right? And that you don't want that. Why? Because God gave us emotions, right? We should feel. We should show affection to our children. We should show affection to each other. It's an important part of experiencing life together. And so sometimes that means tears, but sometimes it means laughter, right? As we celebrate the joys of life together. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Now, these are cultural things, right? Mourning and dancing are sort of cultural expressions of loss and celebration. And so basically what Solomon is saying here is that in life we have both. Right? There are times where the loss calls for mourning. There are times where we experience victory or joy that calls for celebration. But what we do in both of those things is we respond appropriately. Right? Meaning that we mourn with those who mourn. We rejoice with those who rejoice. So, I don't walk into the funeral home high-fiving everybody, I mean, it's not what you do, right? Just like I don't go to a football game, a college football game, right, and preach a funeral sermon, right? You don't do those sorts of things. Why? Because there's a time set for both of those things, and you use them and operate in them in the appropriate way. because it helps us to honor the depth of our human experience, right? It shows people the depth of the human experience in the emotions that we have. There's a time to cast away stones, a time to gather stones, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. Now, casting stones could mean anything. Removing any obstacles from your life. Gathering them could mean preparation, right? Being ready for a season that you know is coming. Not all seasons are shocking. Sometimes you know the season that's coming. Right? Generally, if you have a health issue, right, your body is telling you. You know something's wrong. And so in this case, you'd be gathering the stuff. You'd be preparing for whatever it takes. If you're going to have surgery or whatever, you're preparing for those sorts of things. Some people look at this as a metaphor, like for farming, clearing a field, right? They're clearing the field to get it ready for new, right? For new growth, preparing something for a new project. Some people look at it like that. That's cool too. That's fine. This is poetry. So, there's the interpretation of it is, it's not just a black and white thing. There's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. Listen, boy, I wish this was on TikTok for these kids that watch that all the time. I wish this was on there. Why? Because relationships have a season too. Relationships have a season. There are times for closeness and there are times for distance. Right? Wisdom helps us to know when to nurture relationships and when to step back from them. You don't have to be in a relationship with somebody all the time. Right? But these kids these days, that's what they think. They think that what brings them value is how many boyfriends or how many partners they can have in their life. And that, the weird flex, that, man, I just sounded like a Gen something or whatever they call them now. I'm just going to say flex because the weird flex is this is my body count. This is how many people I've slept with in my life, and people are out there on these YouTube channels like celebrating that stuff. And I'm like, bro, like that's not a good thing, right? That's not a good thing. But they think that embrace, that closeness, it somehow brings value to their life, but it doesn't. It doesn't, because true wisdom is knowing when you should have a relationship with somebody and what an appropriate expression of that relationship is, and when that relationship is becoming not appropriate and when you need to step back from that relationship, right? A time to embrace, a time to refrain from embracing. We have to have a healthy relational dynamic in our life. Those things are important. It's important. But this is not what the world is teaching. There's a time to seek and a time to lose. A time to keep and a time to cast away. There's a time where we pursue goals. There's a time where we accept loss. Listen, this life is not about winning or losing. If you have a relationship with Jesus, you've won. Right? You've won. And so in this life, what we have to embrace sometimes is that even though we have achieved the ultimate victory, it doesn't mean that every single battle that we experience every day is won. It doesn't mean that I'm going to live my life sinless, in sinless perfection, because I don't. There are times when I win, there are times when I lose. But there's a time for both of those things. Right? There's a time where I'm striving and reaching for something, where I'm pursuing a goal with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, and I'm running after something. And there are other times where I'm letting go and saying, listen, this pursuit, it's not it. But that's wisdom. That's acknowledging when something is beyond our reach, and it's okay. It's okay if you agree to do something, and when you're doing it, you realize that you can't do it. It's okay to say those things. That doesn't make you weak. That makes you wise, right? Because if I came up to you and you were like, "Hey, man, I need my gallbladder removed," I was like, "Listen, I'm a doctor. I'll take it out today," right? And imagine I said that to you. And imagine you don't embrace this, and I don't either, and then you're on my kitchen table and I'm removing something. Right? I mean, you see why it's important that we understand when things are beyond our area of expertise, right? I don't my own car, right? I could take a Glock apart, right down to completely. I can take an AR apart. But if my check engine light comes on, I just assume that it's outside of my expertise, because it is. Right? And I'll tell you this, I'll admit this for God and everybody in YouTube. Sometimes those little warning lights that come on my car, I don't even know what they mean. I have to Google that. Right? That's wisdom, is knowing when is this in my wheelhouse and when is this outside of my wheelhouse? When is it something that's within my reach and when is it something that's not? There's a time to keep and a time to cast away. Listen, there are times that you need to hold on to. There are times you need to let go of. Listen, I know in the world that everyone's a victim of everything at all times so that you can get sympathy from everyone, but that's not the biblical way we live our life. That's not biblical Christianity. We're not victims. Things happen in our life. And what we learn is we let go of those things, because those things don't define us. The things that happened in my life that were tragic, I don't hold on to those things. I let go of them because they don't own me. They don't run me. They don't take up space in my mind. I got too many other important things that need that space. But the things I need to hold on to is what I hold on to. The memories, the relationships, those are the things that you hold on tight to. But you understand the flip side, when I need to let go of things. When I need to let go of people that are hindering growth, that are hindering life. There's a time to tear, a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. Now, tearing and sowing are references to, especially in the Old Testament, mourning and then mending. In ancient culture, if you were mourning, and Job even does that, right? He tears their garment and they sit in sackcloth and ash, right? That's things associated with mourning, with grief. And so there are times in our life where we acknowledge brokenness, but there are also times to repair and restore what's been broken. You see, again, removing that perpetual victim mentality. If you really want to make me mad, chain me up and make me watch videos of people who are perpetual victims of everything, right? Vodi Bakum was like talking about CRT. He's like, if you don't know Vodi, he's a black pastor he's teaching in Africa at a university, but in one of his sermons, he's like, everything is racist, right? Like that's when that is your mentality, that everything that happens in your life, you're a victim of every circumstance and everything. Like those are the things that make my blood boil, because you don't understand the Bible. Like you don't understand Christian, and people. There are Christians who believe this way. Well, they have an idea about Christianity that believe this way, that I can be a Christian and be a victim of everything, that everything and everyone is always against me, and that's not true. Right? That because I'm surrounded by Christians who don't look like me, then they'll never understand me. That is a victim mentality. Right? Everyone in this room, no matter what you look like, no matter where you come from, no matter your economic status, you understand sin, you understand the tragedy and the sting that sin brings to this world. You understand the gospel. You understand the grace that God brings to the world. What else do you need to understand? Because everything that happens in this world happens because of one of those two things, either because of sin or because of the grace of God, right? Everything is happening because of one of those two things. And so there are times in our life where we need to acknowledge brokenness, but also understand that we don't live in a perpetual season of brokenness, that season gives way to restoration. That season gives way to repair, to sewing, right? That torn garment. Now, this was a hard one for most people. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. Both silence and speech have their place. Silence can show wisdom, challenge, it can express truth. Yes, all of those things. It can show restraint, can show reverence. All of those things are true. It can do that. But it doesn't mean that you should always be silent. See, there are generally two types of people in this world. There are those who don't know when to stop talking, and those who don't know when to talk, right? In Christianity, we find a balance in the middle and say, listen, I understand when you're grieving that you don't, this is how, when you experience loss, you'll find this out about me. Like, if you think I'm going to roll up to your house and just start spitting facts at you and thinking that's going to help you, that's not the way I operate. I usually show up and listen. Right? If you've ever seen me at a funeral, I don't do a lot of talking. I do a lot of listening. I do a lot of listening. Because that, as people, especially in loss, as they're speaking, they're healing. Right? As they're talking about memories and things that about that person that brought light to their life. That's bringing healing and restoration. It's helping to move them out of that season, right? Now, the flip side is that if you come in to my office for counseling and you're doing dumb stuff, right? That's going to be the other side of this, where you understand that there is a time where communication is what is necessary. There's a time where you need to call out the baloney. Right? If your spouse is acting a fool, there are times where you need to say something. Right? Sometimes there are times where your spouse is saying things that you don't agree with, but they're unloading their emotion, and that's what you're there for. And sometimes you don't need to say anything. Listen, I've learned this about women. They'll tell you a lot of problems with their mouth, but what they don't want you to fix it. They want you to listen. Now, that's a problem for me because my natural inclination is to fix it. And so when somebody's spitting their problems at you, say, well, I mean, you do this, this, and this, and then, boy, there's a time for silence and a time for speaking, right? This is true across the board. We have to use wisdom to understand when both of those are necessary in the relationships that we have, when we do need to be silent and listen, and when we do need to speak. There's a time, listen, I didn't write it, don't get mad at me. There's a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Now, I understand that love is kind of central to our faith. I understand that the love of God is manifest, right? When He sent His Son to die for us, that's the ultimate act of love. But the truth of the matter is we live in a fallen world, maybe a foreign world. We live in a fallen world. And sometimes we hate the things that we see in this world. We hate injustice, we hate sin, we hate evil. Listen, I hate abortion. It's a fact. I believe there's grace if you've had an abortion. I believe God can forgive you 100% and restore you 100%. I believe that God can bring you through that season of loss, that season of that sin. I believe God can bring you out of that into an incredible season of hope and joy, of testimony, and all those things. I 100% believe that, but I hate it. I hate it. Hate it. I hate those sorts of things. I hate injustice in the world. I hate that. I hate it. And so hate doesn't contradict God. It doesn't contradict God's love. God hates things. God hates sin. That's the only logical explanation as to why God would send Jesus to the cross. You have to have such an incredible hatred for sin and a love for your people that you would willingly give your son's life so that your wrath against sin, your perfect, good, holy, just wrath would be satisfied. You got to have a certain feeling about sin to pay that price. In fact, the Bible says God hates the sinner. Take that for what it is, but God hates those things. But He also loves us, right? It's a paradox, like what I talked about on Sunday morning. Those are things that two things we know are true, but it's hard for us to wrap our mind around. So, hate and love, they both reflect God's righteousness when you're confronting things in the world. There's a time for war and a time for peace. War and peace. We know it. It's reality in human history. And most of the time, and I say most of the time, they're driven by justice, by protection, by the resolution of conflict. And peace is the goal, right? That's our goal. But war may be a necessary means toward that goal. It's just the way that it is, right? There is, yeah, it is what it is. Life is complex. And sometimes justice requires action, right? And so Solomon, what he's done here in these 8 verses is he's described sort of the picture of a life that's fully engaged. And so that's the thing about it. That's the thing I want you to remember in all this. Are there any questions about this tonight? We'll be done.